Hello, we're going to start this PowerPoint by talking about the elements of a short story. What makes up a story in general. So this can apply to short stories, it can apply to narratives, novels, novellas, anything that tells a story. So let's talk about some terminology before we get started. First we have plot, setting, characters, point of view, and theme. So the plot is what happens and how it happens in a narrative. A narrative is any work that tells a story, such as a short story, a novel, a drama, or a narrative poem. And especially in the late 1800s, at the end of the century, we were looking at stories that were told in poetic form because it was considered a higher art form in some ways. The novel was still relatively new in the 1800s, so the novel didn't really come into its own till the 20th century. The parts of a plot include the exposition, which are the events that give rise to a conflict or opening situation, the rising action. These are the events that complicate or intensify the central conflict. The climax, which is the highest point of interest or emotional involvement in the story. That's not to be confused with it being the end of the story. The falling action is the logical result of a climax. And then the resolution, which is in fact the final outcome of the story. So if you're looking at it from a perspective of a visual reference, you want to think of it looking somewhat like this. We start with the exposition. Off to the left, we move into the conflict, the rising action, then the climax, which is also called the turning point, then the falling action, and the resolution. So think of it in terms of the gauge of emotional involvement. Then we have conflict. Conflict is a struggle between opposing forces. Every plot must contain some kind of conflict. The worst thing you can do is have a story where nothing really happens. And most of us would probably find it pretty boring. Now, there's an old TV show called Seinfeld, which was famous for it being about nothing. However, in every show, there was some level of conflict. So think about it from the perspective of one of their most famous episodes where they went shopping at the mall and then they spent the entire episode looking for their car in the parking lot because they couldn't find it because it was so big. And they're walking around this giant mall parking lot, schlepping all their packages and fighting about where the car is. That, in fact, was the conflict. So it doesn't have to be a huge conflict, like a war or a love story, but it can be something minor, especially when it's used as satire, which a lot of the Seinfeld episodes emphasized. Stories can have more than one conflict, and the conflicts can be external or internal. External conflict can be an outside force, can be a person, a group, animal, nature, or a non-human obstacle. An internal conflict takes place in a character's mind. So if you look at the pictures that I have at the bottom of this slide, we have Rocky fighting Ivan Drago from, I think, Rocky 4 or 3, one of those Rockies. Anyway, the conflict for him is external. He's fighting the Russian. This was during the Cold War in the late 1980s. So, this represented a conflict that had a political overtone to it. So there was a lot of external conflict going on in this movie. Then you have on the right-hand side a Marvel character called the Incredible Hulk, whose internal conflict manifests itself in a physical way. So every time mild-mannered scientist Bruce Banner gets angry, he turns into a giant, raging green monster. So if you think about it, we all have that moment in our brain when we're so angry about something that we want to throw stuff around and smash stuff and take out an entire city block with our massive fists. And we don't, because we are not, in fact, the physical manifestation of anger that is the Incredible Hulk. So there's some special techniques with plot. We have suspense, which is the excitement or tension. So whenever we see a bomb about to go off and the seconds are ticking down, and the guy who's trying to defuse the bomb is sweating and he's not sure to cut the red wire or the blue wire, that is built into the plot to make it exciting. Then we have foreshadowing, which we've talked a lot about in this class, which is a hint or clue about what will happen in a story. And one of the most common ones that we see is the young teenagers who decide that they're going to get naked and go into the woods and mess around, and inevitably some guy with a hockey mask or a very large knife, machete, shotgun, any instrument of torture that you can think of shows up and is going to definitely kill those kids. So, flashback interrupts the normal sequence of events to tell about something that happened in the past. The movie on the right-hand side there, The English Patient, is told almost exclusively in flashback. A wounded soldier whose face has literally been burned off remembers the big love affair he had before the war. So it kind of makes it even sadder knowing that he has ended up so damaged. Then we have the surprise ending, and this is the conclusion that the reader does not expect, and it often includes irony. So a movie like The Sixth Sense, for example, has a surprise ending, which is at both times shocking and makes you want to watch the movie again, which is fantastic. Another movie which has a great surprise ending is the movie Memento, which was Christopher Nolan's, one of his first movies, and the ending will just take your breath away. So it's definitely recommended. Setting, and this should say setting, but my little clock went over there, which is the time and place where the action occurs. Now, it goes into so much more detail than that. You have to look at the furniture, the scenery, the culture, the transportation, the clothing, the dialects, the weather, because remember, we know that certain weathers have a very symbolic meaning to them. The time of day, again, that has a very symbolic meaning, and the time of year has a very symbolic meaning. All of these things go into creating the mood and the atmosphere in the story so that we get an idea. A story about people living in Philadelphia is going to be much different culturally than the story of the Amish living in Lancaster, which is only an hour away. So that becomes a very important element to pay attention to when you're reading a story. The function of the setting, as I said, is to create a mood or atmosphere, to show a reader a different way of life, to make action seem more real, to be the source of conflict or struggle, and to symbolize an idea. So all of these ideas in the concept of setting contribute to the story, which is why it's so important to pay attention to these things. On the right-hand side here is an excerpt taken from the story The Day the Sun Came Out by D. Johnson. And I'm just going to read it quickly to kind of highlight exactly how effective the details are in creating the image in your mind. We left the home place behind, mile by slow mile, heading for the mountains, across the prairie where the wind blew forever. At first there were 4 of us, with 1 horse wagon and its skimpy load. Pa and I walked because I was a big boy of 11. My 2 little sisters romped and trotted until they got tired and had to be boosted up to the wagon bed. That was no covered Conestoga, like Pa's folks came west in, but just an old farm wagon drawn by 1 weary horse, creaking and rumbling westward to the mountains, through the little woods town where Pa thought he had an old uncle who owned a little 2-bit sawmill. So this verbiage really does bring to mind a poor family. Mom's not in the picture. There's 3 kids. Pa is trying to find an old uncle who may or may not still have this sawmill. So you get a really good idea of how desperate these people are. Next, we're going to look at characterization. And this is when a writer reveals what a character is like and how the character changes throughout the story. There's 2 primary methods of characterization. The first one is direct. The writer tells what the character is like. And then the indirect is the writer shows what a character is like by describing what the character looks like, by telling what the character says and does, and by what other characters say about and do in response to the character. And that's oftentimes a lot more interesting. So here's an example of a direct characterization example. And I have one of those very loud, stupid laughs. I mean, if I ever sat behind myself in a movie or something, I'd probably lean over and tell myself to please shut up. And that is Holden Caulfield from Catcher in the Rye by J.D. Salinger, one of the great books about teenage angst ever written. And this is the character reflecting on his own laugh and how potentially annoying he can be. An indirect characterization example comes from The Lottery by Shirley Jackson. Mrs. Hutchinson came hurriedly along the path to the square, her sweater thrown over her shoulders, and slid into place in the back of the crowd. "Clean forgot what day it was," she said to Mrs. Delacroix, who stood next to her, and they both laughed softly. "Thought my old man was out back stacking wood," Mrs. Hutchinson went on, "and then I looked out the window and the kids was gone, and I remembered it was the 27th and came a-runnin'." She dried her hands on her apron. So from this passage, we get the idea that Mrs. Hutchinson is a mom, she's a wife, she was a farmer's wife. She expected her husband to be out back doing his chores. She expected her kids to be in the yard playing. And she was doing her wifely or housekeeping duties. So in terms of what we see in this indirect characterization, she doesn't claim herself to be anything other than forgetful. It's all the other clues that demonstrate who she really is. So some of the things that you need to look at when we're analyzing characters: the physical appearance of a character, the personality, the background or personal history, the motivation, the relationships, the conflict, and does the character change? The evolution of a character in a story is oftentimes the main plot of a story. The idea of a young man or a young woman leaving home and making their way in the world, those elements are very specific because it shows you not only the character is moving forward physically, but also internally. We're going to talk about point of view, and this is who is telling us the story and why. The third person omniscient generally lets the reader know that the story being told can be trusted. It's reliable. The third person omniscient is often seen with using pronouns like he, she, they. It's like God wrote the book, except God in this case would be the writer. Alternatively, you have the first person narration. This often suggests bias, especially when the narrator discusses events that he or she is a part of. So first-person narration would use I did this and I did that. And the issue again is that in all of our own minds, we prefer to be the hero of a story rather than the villain, even if we are the villain. And as a consequence to that, we skew stories to suit our perspective. And as a consequence, the story may not be as reliable as we normally think it is. So, questions to ask as you read about the narration. First thing, is it first or third person narration? Is it first person? Do you trust the narrator? What does the narrator gain by making us believe their point of view? Does the first person narrator understand his or her own motivations? Is there anything peculiar about the first person narrator? And that's always the fun part, is trying to decide, can I trust the version of this story? You know, a lot of times in real life, when we're talking with people, we start to get the idea that maybe they're not really on the up and up, that they're telling stories that seem impossible or fantastical, and we begin to distrust their version of events. Well, it's the same thing, and it's a technique writers use in order for the reader to guess whether the narrator is someone they can trust. Lastly, would the story change if the narration or the narrator were different? And again, you know, looking at it from a different perspective. There's an old movie, I think it's by Kurosawa, called The Seven Samurai, and it's about a battle scene. And each of the seven samurai tell their version of the events. And of course, all 7 versions are different because we as humans have this overwhelming desire to make ourselves the hero of the story. Lastly, we're going to talk about theme. And we've talked about theme before, so I'm not going to spend too much time going over it. The theme is your central message, concern, or insight into life expressed through a literary work. And it is our job as the reader to interpret what the theme is. So part of the process of reading is interpreting. Not just the symbolism, not just foreshadowing, not just characterization, but the overall central message. So this is an example of a theme, and it comes from a story called A Man Without a Country by Edward Hale. And in it, he says, every man needs to feel allegiance to his native country, whether he always appreciates that country or not. So what you see here is the theme is about patriotism, loyalty. And we as the reader understand that even though we may love our country, we don't love it all the time. You know, there's always things that happen that make us uncomfortable. The choices our leaders make are not always the best ones. And so we as the people in the country, we feel allegiance to our country, but we may not always appreciate it. So that finishes up this presentation. If you have any questions, feel free to email me or text me. I hope you have a wonderful day, and thanks for listening.